Most people think clutter only matters when it becomes visible. After 60, it begins shaping the mind quietly, long before anything looks out of place. It influences how easily thoughts settle, how often attention wanders, how much effort ordinary moments seem to require. Nothing looks wrong. Yet the mind feels less rested than it should, as if something unseen is gently pulling at it throughout the day. Helen is in her early 70s. She lives alone in a home that has remained largely unchanged, even as her life has shifted around it. The space feels familiar, even orderly. Still, her thoughts linger longer than they once did. Small decisions seem to follow her. Mental energy feels easier to spend and slower to recover. She senses that her environment is quietly participating in this change, asking more of her attention than it used to, though she can't point to any single reason. This reflection isn't about urgency or correction. It's about clarity, about understanding how the relationship between space and mind subtly evolves with age, and why recognizing that shift often brings relief before any physical change is made. Awareness, at this stage of life, becomes its own form of solution. Wise aging seniors exists for moments like this, a shared place to slow the pace and see things more clearly. Not rushed answers, but understanding that makes the next choice feel lighter. A conversation that holds whether someone lives alone, with a partner, or in a home still finding its balance. What follows isn't a set of instructions. It's simply what tends to become visible with time. The first thing most people never notice is this. Clutter rarely weighs on the mind because of what it is. Its weight comes from what has never been fully settled, from decisions that were postponed gently without urgency, and then left quietly open. Helen doesn't feel surrounded by too many things. What she carries is awareness, a subtle ongoing sense of what still needs deciding. Objects she no longer reaches for, yet hasn't consciously released. Not because they matter deeply, but because they were never closed as a chapter. They exist in a kind of mental holding space that follows her from room to room. She notices it in small, almost invisible moments. A drawer she opens just far enough to take what she needs, then closes again without really seeing what's inside. Papers she has already read and understood, yet keeps nearby for now. Items that don't interrupt her day, but quietly remain present in her thoughts. They don't demand action. They simply stay unfinished. Earlier in life, this kind of postponement felt harmless. Time felt abundant. Attention renewed itself easily. Leaving things unresolved didn't carry much cost. But as the years pass, something shifts. Mental energy no longer replenishes as quickly. Focus becomes more valuable than speed, and what once felt neutral begins to register as background effort. Each unfinished decision quietly asks the mind to remember it exists, to track it, to keep a small thread of attention attached. One thread doesn't matter much on its own, but many of them together create a low, constant sense of mental occupation that never fully clears. A room can look calm, surfaces can appear orderly, nothing seems out of place. And yet the mind stays gently busy, moving between what is present and what is unresolved. This isn't stress or anxiety, it's cognitive weight without urgency, the kind that slowly dulls clarity. What begins to help isn't rushing to decide everything. It's recognizing which things still ask for attention simply because they were never given closure. Once something is clearly seen as unfinished, it no longer needs to hover silently in the background. Over time, Helen comes to understand that calm doesn't come from having less. It comes from carrying fewer open loops. And that realization quietly changes how she experiences her space, one settled decision at a time. Once that first awareness takes hold, another pattern begins to surface, often without being named. Tolerance for background noise, not sound, but the constant visual and mental friction of a lived-in space, quietly starts to thin. It isn't the kind of noise that can be turned off. It's the low, ongoing work the mind does to adjust, to compensate, to stay slightly alert. Things that once blended seamlessly into the background now ask for a small amount of attention each time they appear. Helen doesn't describe her home as cluttered or busy. It feels calm enough at a glance. Yet she notices how often she prepares before she can rest. She searches just a little longer than she expects. She shifts items before sitting down. She clears a space before she allows herself to relax. None of these actions feel difficult or annoying. They simply feel necessary, as though ease requires a brief negotiation first. Earlier in life, these moments passed without registering. The mind absorbed them easily. Energy returned on its own. Focus adjusted without effort. But over time, that buffer grows thinner. The ability to ignore small interruptions fades. What once felt neutral now carries a quiet cost in attention. Helen begins to understand that this kind of background noise is cumulative. One small adjustment doesn't matter. Two don't either. But many of them, repeated quietly throughout the day, keep the mind slightly engaged when it would rather soften. The body can sit down, but the mind takes longer to arrive. Rest becomes something that needs preparation. Ease feels conditional. What makes this shift easy to overlook is that it doesn't announce itself as discomfort. There's no sharp irritation, no clear signal that something is wrong. Instead, it shows up as effort arriving before ease. A sense that settling in takes more steps than it used to. That calm is delayed, not denied. What begins to help isn't eliminating every interruption or striving for perfect order. It's noticing where attention is repeatedly being asked to stay active, where the body instinctively organizes the space before allowing itself to rest. Once these patterns are seen, small changes tend to follow naturally, without pressure or urgency. Over time, Helen realizes that calm isn't only about quiet surroundings. It's about how little the space asks of her focus. When that demand softens, the mind settles more quickly. Rest no longer needs to be negotiated. It simply arrives. As attention settles from the earlier realizations, a deeper layer quietly comes into view. It has less to do with effort and more to do with time. Some belongings don't demand attention through use or inconvenience. They do it by orientation. They quietly point the mind backward, even when the body is firmly in the present. Helen begins to notice this in objects she rarely touches, not because they cause discomfort and not because they carry sadness. In fact, many of them feel neutral, familiar, almost invisible. And yet they belong to ways of living that no longer shape her days. Old routines, former interests, earlier rhythms of life that ended naturally, without ceremony. These objects sit still. They don't interrupt her, but they quietly remind her of who she used to be when they mattered. They create a subtle split in attention, part of the mind anchored in the present moment, part of it oriented toward another season of life. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make the present feel slightly less settled. What takes time to recognize is that these belongings aren't simply holding memory. Memory can be warm and grounding. These objects do something different. They influence where attention lands. They quietly suggest relevance where it no longer exists. They keep the mind lightly engaged with identities that have already run their course. Helen notices how this affects her without her realizing it. A sense of mild restlessness. A feeling that something hasn't fully caught up. Not loss, just misalignment. The space reflects a life that has already shifted, and the mind keeps adjusting to that gap. This is where many people pause without language. Whether someone lives alone with a partner or somewhere in between, this experience appears in countless homes, not as clutter, not as disorder, but as time that has accumulated gently, waiting to be acknowledged. What begins to help isn't forcing decisions or erasing the past. It's recognizing which objects still pull attention toward versions of life that no longer need maintenance. When that awareness arrives, it often brings relief rather than sadness. Because letting the present fully occupy its own space doesn't diminish what came before. It simply allows attention to settle where life is actually being lived now. Over time, Helen understands that alignment isn't about forgetting who she was. It's about allowing her surroundings to reflect who she is today. And when the space stops asking her to hold multiple seasons at once, the mind begins to feel more grounded. Not because anything was taken away, but because attention finally has a place to rest. After attention has been pulled by unfinished decisions, background effort, and time held in objects, another influence begins to make itself felt. It's quieter but more physical. It shows up in the way energy moves through the body and how easily the mind follows. As recovery becomes more important, space starts to play a larger role in whether rest actually arrives. Not just physical rest, but mental settling, the point where the mind finally loosens its grip and stops scanning. Helen notices how often rest is preceded by preparation. Before she can sit comfortably, she clears a surface. Before she relaxes, she shifts items out of reach. Before she pauses, she makes room, not just around her, but for herself. These actions aren't habits from the past. They've emerged naturally, without planning. Her body seems to know what it needs before her mind names it. What's striking is that she isn't responding to discomfort. Nothing hurts. Nothing feels wrong. What she feels instead is resistance, a subtle sense that the space is slightly out of sync with how her energy now moves. The room isn't hostile. It's just not quite ready for stillness. Early in life, recovery happened quickly. Energy bounced back on its own. Sitting down was enough. Pausing meant resting. But now the mind pays closer attention to its surroundings before it settles. It looks for alignment, for signals that it's safe to soften. Helen begins to see that this isn't about making things perfect or removing everything in sight. It's about how much negotiation is required before ease can begin. When the environment asks her to adjust, move, or prepare first, rest feels conditional. When it doesn't, rest arrives more naturally. This is where space quietly becomes part of energy management. Not as a project and not as a goal, but as support. Areas that require fewer adjustments allow the mind to settle faster. Spaces that reflect how the body actually moves now help energy recover instead of drain. What starts to help isn't effort, but alignment. Letting commonly used areas reflect real patterns instead of old ones. Allowing space to meet the body where it is today, not where it once was. These shifts don't demand speed. They unfold gently, guided by awareness rather than urgency. Over time, Helen realizes that rest isn't something she has to earn. It's something the space can either invite or delay. When the environment stops resisting her need to pause, her energy recovers more fully. The mind settles sooner, and stillness feels less like an achievement and more like a natural response to being supported. At some point, a different understanding begins to take shape. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady enough to feel certain once it arrives. Clutter is often treated as a matter of possessions. Too many things, not enough space. But what becomes clear later in life is that the true weight doesn't come from objects themselves. It comes from what was never finished internally, from decisions set aside with good intentions, from identities that remained partially open even after life quietly moved on, from attention stretched across years of unresolved choosing. The mind isn't overwhelmed by volume. It's burdened by incompletion. Each postponed decision leaves a conversation open. Each undefined belonging keeps a small part of attention engaged. Over time, these open loops don't fade, they accumulate, and the mind, rather than asking for fewer things, begins to ask for resolution. This is why letting go often brings relief before anything physical changes. Clarity arrives the moment something is mentally closed, even if it's still sitting in the same place. The mind responds immediately to closure. It releases attention that was never meant to be held indefinitely. What becomes helpful here isn't urgency or sweeping change. It's honesty, naming what no longer needs deliberation, acknowledging when a choice has already been made by time itself, allowing certain questions to finally be answered, even quietly. When closure begins to replace postponement, something shifts. Attention gathers instead of scattering. Energy feels more contained. The space starts to feel lighter, not because it holds less, but because the mind is no longer carrying unfinished weight. This realization reframes everything that came before. The goal was never to have less. It was to carry less unresolved attention. And once that becomes clear, the path forward feels calmer, more intentional, and far less demanding. Nothing in Helen's home looks dramatically different. The furniture is familiar. The rooms still hold the same shape. But something has shifted in how the space feels. There's less hesitation in her movements, less mental checking before she sits down or moves from one room to another. The house no longer feels like it's quietly waiting for her to resolve something before she can rest. It meets her where she is. She notices it most in the pauses. When she sits, her mind arrives with her instead of a few moments later. When she wakes, the day doesn't feel crowded before it begins. The rooms feel settled, not because they are empty, but because they no longer hold unanswered questions. What once asked for attention has either found its place or released it. This is the quiet change many people miss. Not transformation, not perfection, but ease. The kind that comes when attention is no longer spread thin across unfinished thoughts. The kind that allows space to feel supportive instead of demanding. Helen hasn't simplified her life. She's clarified it. And that clarity carries through her days in small, steady ways. After 60, clarity doesn't come from doing more or owning less. It comes from reducing what quietly asks for your attention. The half-decisions, the lingering maybes, the things that no longer belong to the present moment. Thank you for spending this time here. If this reflection resonated, you can help it reach others by using the Hype feature on the YouTube app. Scroll down, swipe left on the comment preview carousel until the Hype button appears, tap it, choose how many points to give, remembering that smaller creators receive a larger boost, and confirm. You receive 3 free hypes each week, and each one helps this message rise so more people can discover it. You may also see a Hype Star badge as a sign of community support. If it feels right, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so we can keep growing the Wise Aging Seniors community together, thoughtfully, steadily, and with respect for the season of life we're in.